In this video, I will go through how to develop a good research question. I hope you will not interpret this as the only way to develop a research question, but it will at least indicate how a research question is generally developed. As I will show you, you can develop a research question using the following steps. Start with a broad topic, do preliminary research, narrow down topic, evaluate the soundness of your research question, and then reconsider your research question. In practice, you are always jumping back and forth between these steps. Developing a research question is seldom as straightforward as I will be explaining it. But that being said, in this video, I will go through these steps one by one, recognizing that the process might not be as clear-cut as I'm presenting it today. So the first thing you often do is start with a fairly broad question. It may be something that you are interested in investigating, and you are also willing to take the time necessary to carry out that project. You have like an idea of what you want to study. So let's say, for example, you are interested in studying something concerning international students in higher education. Sounds great. But although you have this intent, you haven't yet adequately honed in on what you specifically want to study. Accordingly, this intent is far too broad, and you haven't yet managed to formulate your research question. Therefore, you need to take the next step. So in order to develop your research question, you need to find out more about that topic. Accordingly, if you want to study international students in higher education, you should find and read studies that have looked into international students in higher education. This can often be quite a fun period where you get to read a lot of research on the topic you are interested in. It is a time for discovery, but also a time for careful work. There are those who want to skip this stage and go straight into the research, but I would almost venture to say that the research results in that case risks being substandard. This part then usually forms the basis of the section that we describe in papers and in thesis work as the previous research section. And this is a really important stage because, among other things, it frames the field we are working in and makes visible what research gaps there are. It also helps us keeps us up to date on the latest research. But most importantly, it makes it clearer for us what kind of research question is relevant to study in light of the previous research. So after doing this quite basic work, you can finally formulate your research question. This is because you now know what kind of research that has previously been done, and more importantly, what research has not yet been done. If there are any problems with the research that you found, or if you have any perspective or material that you think might contribute to the understanding of what you want to study. So you can now formulate your research question and make your intent of study more specific. So, for instance, using our previous question, a more specific research question that you might be able to develop after reading a lot of material related to the question might be, what effect does mentoring from master's level students have on the sense of belonging among first-year international students at Swedish universities? So when you've developed your research question, you need to critically evaluate it. Here, you can look at the following things. First question then, you should ask yourself, is it researchable? Is it possible to get an answer to your research question? I mean, I might wish to get an answer about the meaning of life, but I can't develop any test that will ever give me a satisfactory answer to that question. The closest I perhaps can come is studying what others have said about the meaning of life, but I can't take it any further. So is a question about the meaning of life researchable? Probably not. So going back to our research question, we can see here that it is actually researchable. The question deals with people that we have reasonable access to, international students in Sweden. So there shouldn't be any problem from a general perspective of doing this study. So, it's researchable. Then you should ask yourself, is it feasible? Can you arrive at an answer to this question based on the time and the practical constraints you are facing? Accordingly, if you don't have time to do the study, then the research question probably isn't right for you. Also, you should ask yourself if you have the relevant skills necessary to do the study required to answer that research question. I mean, I would perhaps be interested in studying teaching using neuroscientific methodology, but I don't know anything really about that research field. Accordingly, I shouldn't develop a research question that requires me to have these kinds of skills or possess knowledge that I don't. So concerning our example then, a skillful researcher with ample time would be able to do this study. However, as this study will probably require you to do some empirical work, perhaps doing interviews with students or sending out a survey, you have to ask yourself if you are knowledgeable in empirical methodology. And if you're not, can you do this study? Probably not. Also, do you have the time for an extensive study? Meaning, do you have the possibility to reach students in all the universities in Sweden? That takes a lot of time, so you probably don't have time for that. Therefore, you should probably adjust your question. Perhaps you can concentrate on international students at just one university, perhaps Malmö University, for instance. So, and this gets us to our next points, which is related to this one. Is your study limited enough so that you can arrive at an answer to the question that you want to study? We can't make the research question too broad, because then it is not reasonable that we are able to answer that question. For instance, I might want to know how the attitude of all the world's students to distance learning has changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I don't have reasonable access to these students. Therefore, it is more reasonable that I limit my question to, for example, again, Malmö University, whose students I actually can reach and talk to. If you look again at our example, then you have to ask yourself if you have reasonable access to all the international students in all the universities in Sweden. If you don't, then this research question is probably too broad for you to research and perhaps should be limited further to make it researchable. Again, perhaps you can limit yourself to Malmö University. The next question is the other side of the coin from if a research question is limited enough. Is it complex enough? You should also ask yourself if your research question is complex enough, meaning is it broad enough? Sometimes a question can be too small. In other words, you don't really have to do much research to do the study. For instance, if your question can be answered as a yes or no question, then you should probably make your question more complex. If we look at our question then, it is complex enough. This is a first study that you need to do. So it is complex. However, let's just speculate. If you would have had a question something in line with, and this is quite ridiculous, of course, but just as an example, if your question was, does Malmö University have international students? Then, as you probably understand, that question would not be complex enough because it's quite easy to answer. Then, after that, you have to ask yourself if your research question is relevant. For instance, ask yourself if your question deals with a problem that is important to address. Or does your question address a topic that hasn't been addressed previously? Or does the question advance the field of study that you're in? If your research question is perhaps only interesting for you, then it may not be worth studying besides privately. Going back to a previous point that I made, one way of checking if it is an interesting question is by reading then academic papers related to your field of study. That way you can get a sense of what topics are of interest within the field. Also, you can present your question to colleagues and other researchers and get feedback from them. You should be able to gauge whether your question is of interest from their responses. Looking at our question then, I would argue that it is relevant. It is important to study what practices can enable international students to increase their sense of belonging. A study like this might therefore enable the development of new strategies when addressing inclusivity among students at university. So, it is a relevant question, in my opinion. Finally, you have to ask if your study is, or if it can be done ethically. This is sometimes necessary to ask. All too often in the history of science, people have asked questions that perhaps should not be studied, but have done the study anyway. There are horrible examples of studies that have been done on prisoners or other marginalized persons. So it's unimportant. If your question is unethical and studies on things that you can't do in other ways than unethically, then you probably shouldn't study that question. Also, some studies might require you to make ethical considerations before beginning the study. For instance, most medical studies require the researcher to do an ethical review before beginning their study. If they are, just to take on one example, doing studies involving animal testing, they need to explain how they are limiting the suffering of the animals. But it is also important to do an ethical review if your question addresses issues that are sensitive in some way. For instance, questions pertaining to ethnicity, sexuality, or political affiliations, just to mention a few examples. In our example, the question is ethical. It's not a problem in and of itself to do this study. It will probably touch upon some sensitive topics. Therefore, before the study is conducted, ethical considerations should be addressed, not least on how you will obtain the consent to participate in the study from the students that you are studying. So, after you've done all this, you can start to do your research project based on the question that you have. However, as you'll notice, what often happens is that as you do your research, you'll find that your research question needs to be rephrased. Things happen during the research process that force us to reevaluate what we want to do. Perhaps your material doesn't answer your question, or is it that it answers something that is even more interesting than your previous research question? Maybe you ran out of time and you now don't have time to answer the whole question, but you can narrow it further and answer something related to that question. Whatever the case, at this stage, you need to go back and modify your question so that it corresponds to what you have done, or in a way that it corresponds to the answer you can give. Formulating a research question is thus an ongoing process, with the question you have evolving the further you get into the research that you're doing. So it's an evolving process. So these were just some considerations when developing your research questions. In the next video, you will get the opportunity to practice what you just learned in a small exercise. So see you in the next video.